The overwhelming consensus of economists and market analysts say that the economy in 2026 will continue to grow. I'm sorry, what? The New York Fed data shows about 4.5% of household debt was in some stage of delinquency by Q3 of 2025, with 90-day plus and severe delinquency rates now above pre-pandemic levels. Delinquencies in credit cards, student loans, and some auto and mortgage pockets, especially among younger and lower income borrowers, are climbing at a record pace. Seeking Alpha's analysis estimates there were around 3 million auto repossessions in 2025, a level not seen since the 2009 financial crisis. A National Housing Conference report finds fewer than 15% of sampled occupations can afford a typical home, down from 37% just 6 years ago. Nearly 2/3 of people say that they switched to cheaper groceries or bought less food, and about half tapped into savings to cover everyday expenses. Nearly 70% of Americans believe the traditional American dream no longer holds true, citing affordability pressures as a core reason. I started out trying to write this episode about predicting the impact of the economy on small companies, startups, and individuals. Once I started seeing those rosy predictions, I couldn't commit to that narrative anymore. Digging into the underlying data, I realized the U.S. economy in 2026 will be brought to you by the letter K. How the average American can suffer while the Fed's economic data shows we are doing just peachy, why a single consonant may become your least favorite letter in the alphabet, and what you can do to survive what might be a troubling 2026. So how can the average American consumer feel squeezed while the key reporting metrics all show a growing and relatively healthy economy? Short answer, because most of those metrics aren't actually tied to the average American taxpayer's real-world experience. They're either statistically incomplete or over-indexed on business and corporate output. Let's take a few of the big ones. First, GDP. That's the headline metric for most people. It's supposed to measure the overall growth of the economy over some period of time, usually quarterly or annually. But GDP measures total production and spending, not who benefits. It can rise even when median real incomes fall or financial security stagnates. It counts spending on things like major accident repairs or disaster rebuilding and doesn't net out resource depletion, debt buildup, or inequality. So it often overstates true well-being when growth is driven by costs or concentrated benefit. The second misleading metric, unemployment rates. There are actually two unemployment reports, the U3 and the U6. Now stay with me here. Let's only get super nerdy for a second. U3 only counts people actively looking for work and says nothing about job quality, hours, or pay. It doesn't measure underemployment, where people may be working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. The broader data used by the U6 report, which includes discouraged workers and those stuck in part-time jobs, usually shows much higher underemployment and often tracks the hidden slack and wage stagnation people feel. But we don't talk about the U6, so we essentially get incomplete data. The Consumer Price Index and personal consumption expenditures, CPI and PCE for short, are widely used to measure inflation, another key economic metric we see splashed across headlines. Just a quick aside, because it seems the definition of inflation gets misused and contorted through a combination of ignorance and intellectual malpractice. Inflation is the general rise in prices of goods and services across the economy over time, which reduces the purchasing power of money. In layman's terms, you get less for your money. I hope you're enjoying the content, and if you are, please consider subscribing to the channel. Back to the episode. Back to CPI and PCE. Official inflation tracks the average price change of a fixed basket. It does not fully capture housing, childcare, medical, and regional cost pressures that usually dominate many households' budgets. I'm not sure about you, but housing and medical are huge buckets in my household, and they aren't even counted. Because spending patterns differ by income group, low-income and younger households often experience much higher effective inflation than the CPI average, especially when rents and food outpace other categories. Don't miss that key term, effective inflation, because the CPI and PCE don't measure that, just a basket of items that were determined a half-century ago. Like the other major metrics, CPI and PCE are only reported in the aggregate, a weighted number that fails to show the chasm between the top 10% and the rest of the population. And that brings us back to that shitty little letter K, as in K-shaped economy. A K-shaped economy is one where different groups or sectors move in sharply different directions at the same time. Some are doing better and moving up, while others are doing worse and moving down. The term comes from the literal shape of the letter K. The upper arm represents groups whose incomes, jobs, or assets are improving, and the lower arm represents those whose conditions are flat or deteriorating, even though aggregate indicators may show overall growth. In a K-shaped economy, higher income households, strong market sectors like big tech, and asset owners see rising incomes, wealth, and spending, while lower income households and weaker sectors face stagnant or falling incomes and greater hardship. According to the economists at Moody's, as of September of 2025, the top 10% of wealthiest households in the U.S. represented 50% of all consumer spending. That means just 13 million of the 130 million households in the U.S. are responsible for 50% of spending. That's not explicitly represented in any of this economic data. And there it is, the fundamental disconnect between the stats and the reality for most Americans. Because the top 10% are doing well, the aggregated economic measures show a stable, if not slightly growing, economy. And it's not just spending. The majority of the ultra-wealthy in the U.S. derive most, if not all, of their income through ownership, not employment. They own businesses or equity that produces income or ownership that can be traded for income. Overwhelmingly, that ownership is in the form of shares of publicly traded stocks. Now, consider the Federal Reserve states that 90% of the U.S. stock market is owned by just 10% of the wealthiest households in America. The U.S. stock market gained approximately $10 trillion in value through the end of November of 2025. That translates into the top 10% of wealthiest households in America seeing an aggregated expansion of their wealth of $9 trillion. That means each of those households potentially increasing their wealth in just 11 months by $827,000. That's not their total wealth, just how much it potentially increased in 11 months. The average household income in the U.S. as of 2024, 89% less than that, roughly $84,000. I'm starting to understand these calls to eat the rich. Certainly feels like we're living in an economy designed by Marie Antoinette, even if she never actually told people they could just eat cake. This is not the first time we've gone K-shaped. The U.S. has gone through earlier K-shaped phases as recently as the post-2008 recovery and the post-2020 COVID recovery. Two periods that may have been the most dramatic examples of this K-shaping, and both caused lasting income and economic inequality. After the Great Recession of 2009, GDP and corporate profits recovered, and the S&P 500 entered a decade-long bull market. But wage growth for non-college and lower-income workers was weak for many years, with joblessness and underemployment elevated well into the mid-2010s. This is where underemployment became pervasive, but largely unaccounted for in the unemployment numbers. Just like now, asset owners benefited disproportionately from rising stock and home prices, while renters and workers in deindustrialized regions faced stagnant incomes and higher housing costs, widening inequality through much of the 2010s. There was some wage gain recovery in 2017 and 2018, but didn't come close to closing the gaps created in the previous 10 years. The term K-shaped recovery actually entered popular use during the COVID shock, as higher income, remote-capable workers in sectors like tech, finance, and online services bounced back quickly, while low-wage service workers, restaurant, hospitality, and travel suffered deep, prolonged job and income losses. Massive monetary and physical support drove sharp rises in stock and home prices, boosting the wealth of asset-owning households, even as millions were unemployed and many small businesses closed, driving U.S. inequality not seen since the 1920s. Justin Vassallo may have summarized it best just a few weeks ago by writing, quote, "Over the last few decades, the regressive shift in income distribution and perhaps more importantly, how disposable income is used by nominally middle-class households has diminished our ability to judge traditional macroeconomic indicators with much confidence. But the disconnect between how economists evaluate the economy and how ordinary Americans navigate it has become far more pronounced in the pandemic's aftermath," end quote. And let's not forget that roughly 250 million Americans will see their health insurance premiums increase in 2026, increases far exceeding inflation, wage growth, and Social Security adjustments. The Century Foundation reported that 48% of U.S. voters stated they used savings to cover routine expenses when responding to their survey. 66% of respondents said the U.S. economy is not doing well, and 82% said they expect the cost of living to go up in 2026. That's beyond poor sentiment. It's an outright cry for help. In addition, many of those surveys said they stopped contributing to savings and retirement plans, They've put off major purchases like appliances and vehicles, have delayed or even canceled medical procedures, and some have actually started buying less food or even skipping meals. Michael Green recently published a piece on his Substack where he re-engineered the original 1960s poverty line logic using today's spending patterns based on how costs have changed in the last 60 plus years. He's arguing that if you honestly cost out what it takes for a family of four to function in modern America without benefits, the break-even household income is closer to roughly $140,000 than to the official $32,000 threshold claimed by the Fed. His article highlighted the poverty rate was calculated off a formula from the 1960s, where the poverty line was set at 3 times the cost of a minimal food diet. Green kept that multiplier idea, but updated it using today's budget shares, where food is only about 5 to 7% of spending, and housing, childcare, healthcare, and transportation dominate. In simplest terms, the percentage of household costs tied to food have gone down relative to the ballooning costs of housing, childcare, healthcare, and transportation. This was a controversial piece, but it highlighted more statistical malfeasance in how the government represents the economy. So while the traditional GDP, CPI, and unemployment numbers may find ways to paint a statistically pleasant picture, we're far more likely to see the economy fail to support the average American's financial well-being in 2026. At some point, even the top 10% can't eke out more profits from wildly irrational PE ratios on wildly overpriced stocks. Home prices can't continue to rise 15% per year, and at some point, companies can't financially engineer their way out of a paper tiger economy while an average U.S. household triages their bank account to decide if they want to pay the power bill or buy groceries. I'm sure some of you are starting to think this sounds like a stump speech at an AOC or Bernie Sanders rally. Yes, there are shared themes, but I'm not trying to make a political point here. And I don't think I'm being overly dramatic. If anything, the current statistics around debt levels, car loan delinquencies, and basic affordability metrics, all of which are leading indicators of a souring economy, should have everyone acting a little more dramatic. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce offered a basic economics test, assessing a participant's general knowledge of economics and how it works in the U.S. 86% of adults failed that test, even though nearly 3/4 expressed confidence explaining how the system works. Simply put, we're dumb when it comes to the economy. We don't know how most of this works. And what's worse, we think we know what we're talking about. Ignorance and confidence are a dangerous combination. This is also why we can be so easily manipulated into believing the incomplete and cherry-picked numbers we're fed. Politicians certainly have a vested interest in their constituents thinking things are great because that's how they get reelected. But it's also in the best interest of banks, financial advisors, credit card companies, loan officers, employers, stockbrokers, cryptocurrency exchanges, even salespeople on car lots. If we believe everything is okay, we spend more. We take on more debt. We bet on that promotion or raise that may not be coming. We cheer when interest rates plummet, not understanding that low interest rates can bring on increased inflation. That confidence and the behavior driven by it is the linchpin of the consumer spending needed to support a healthy and growing U.S. economy. We all need to start reading behind the headlines. We must, at a bare minimum, ask follow-up questions or look at even a fraction of the underlying data. If nothing else, just adopt a modicum of healthy skepticism. There's a reason none of this feels right, because the truth isn't in that 30-second TikTok or the first paragraph of a Substack newsletter. I know I'm on a soapbox here, and this content is a little far afield from the normal content I produce, but we have to understand how the economy in 2026 will affect all of us, especially my channel's audience of young professionals, startup founders, and tech workers. Understanding the 2026 macro setup is a survival skill, not a nice-to-have for founders, tech workers, and young professionals, because it directly affects funding, jobs, real income, and long-term wealth. Founders who track growth, inflation, and rate expectations can time fundraising better and design models that work under tighter capital conditions. The K-shaped, affordability-strained environment means top decile customers may be fine, while mass market demand is fragile, which should determine whether you build premium versus access-priced products. Unemployment and churn in some white-collar tech roles may manifest as firms use AI and automation to manage costs. Tech workers who understand that can position into functions or verticals that benefit from AI instead of crowded, rate-sensitive niches. Young professionals face structurally higher housing costs, elevated debt burdens, and tighter credit than prior cohorts. real wages and asset access are heavily path dependent on macro policy and cycles. Understanding the basics around inflation, rates, and housing dynamics helps with decisions on renting versus buying, fixed versus variable debt, when to lock in mortgages, and how to manage your basic spending. 2026 growth will be meaningfully shaped by policy. So founders and workers who understand that link can align products, locations, and hiring with subsidized or protected areas. AI and automation are both growth drivers and labor headwinds. Understanding that dual role is critical for choosing what to build, which skills to develop, and how to negotiate compensation and equity in a world where productivity gains aren't likely to flow to labor. So yes, 2026 is going to be hard. The data doesn't lie. Pretending otherwise won't protect you from what's coming. But here's the thing, you're not powerless. Understanding this K-shaped reality means you can position yourself accordingly. If you're a founder, build for the customers who have spending power or solve real affordability problems for the ones who don't. If you're a tech worker, invest in skills that complement AI rather than compete with it. If you're a young professional trying to build wealth, make decisions with open eyes about what housing, debt, and savings actually cost in this environment. Knowledge is the edge. Now you have it. The economy may be designed to favor the top 10%, but you don't need to be in that bracket to survive. You just need to stop believing the aggregated numbers that tell you everything's fine when your bank account says otherwise. Question the data. Plan for the reality you're living, not the one being sold to you. And remember, every K-shaped recovery eventually ends, but the people who navigate it with clarity and intention are the ones who come out stronger on the other side. That can be you, but only if you're willing to understand what's actually happening and act accordingly. That's it for this episode. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.